Hello and welcome to our first question and answer session with Bishop Cherry. My name is Deborah Goddard. I'm the Communications Officer at the Diocese of Monmouth. During these difficult times, communications has been quite challenging and we've had to think of different ways to stay connected. We thought it'd be a really good idea if we asked you guys to put your questions to Bishop Cherry, whether silly or serious, it didn't matter. So let's see what burning questions you have, and here's question 1.
Joe Chesterman asks, what support is being offered to churches to ensure that they can open as safely and as soon as possible? What I have seen is churches now opening in cities, but more urban and rural churches taking more time to open.
Thanks, Joe. The bishops have been very clear that whilst the government has allowed churches to open for public worship, none must feel obliged to do so. The last thing we want is for church wardens and others to feel under pressure to open before they're ready or are able to have the proper safety measures in place. The archdeacons are there to offer support and advice and to work with parishes to ensure that the risk assessments have been done and all the necessary measures required by the Welsh Government are in place. This diocese has also made some money available via the diocesan office to those parishes that need help in buying hand gels, cleaning materials and other items that are required by law. In terms of your point about the rural and more urban churches perhaps being a bit slower to open up, I know that in many cases the congregations in these areas are small, with few people around to do all that's necessary to ensure everyone's safety, but also that many of them come in the vulnerable categories, either because of age or because of underlying health conditions for them or for a family member. Some are understandably nervous about coming out and meeting people, as are congregation members. Whilst we all want our churches to be open as soon as possible, it's important that we respect people's vulnerabilities and nervousness and work with them as and when they feel ready and safe enough to do so.
Where is the church going in terms of same-sex marriage?
Well, where we are at the moment is that the doctrine on marriage has not changed, and that marriage can only be entered into by a man and a woman. This, of course, puts the Church in Wales at odds with civic society, which allows two people of the same sex to be married. The Church in Wales has responded to this in two ways. First, it has asked for further theological work to be done on the doctrine of marriage in the light of the history of marriage and its purpose, and how the Church should respond to the reality of same-sex marriage from a scriptural point of view. The other thing that the Church in Wales is doing is to produce rites of blessing for couples in a same-sex relationship. This came out of a debate at the governing body a few years ago, where the governing body agreed that the present situation is pastorally unsustainable and that the Church needs to find ways of welcoming and affirming couples in a same-sex relationship and of celebrating their love and commitment to one another, be that in a marriage or a civil partnership.
Hello, Bishop Cherry. My name's David Collins. I worship in the the ministry area of Kincoed, but I worship ecumenically as well. I wonder what your views were as we slowly emerge from lockdown and churches start to open, whether we should just concentrate on catering for our existing flock or whether this is a time when we should be looking to outreach to the community and show the community at large that churches are open for business.
One of the interesting things about the 4 months of lockdown is just how involved many of our churches have been in reaching out to the communities around them. Indeed, I think some probably have done more reaching out in lockdown than they'd perhaps been doing before. So, in that sense, the church has remained open for business. Although the church buildings have been closed, the church, as the people of God, has been very active, phoning, Zooming, maintaining a sense of community even as people were isolated. As well as praying, worshipping and doing Bible studies together, people have been looking after their neighbours, staffing food banks, fetching prescriptions, doing errands, all manner of things in the community, which has been wonderful to see. So as we come out of lockdown, at the moment, at any rate, we need to remember that the church is never just about us, a community of faith that's only for our own personal benefit. We're called to be salt and light and yeast, to serve the communities in which we're set, to feed the hungry, to be Christ's hands and feet. There are endless passages in the Bible that talk about engaging with and transforming the world with God's love. Our prayer, worship and community life as a church simply equips us for that and reminds us that we are first and foremost children of God, channels through which his love and mercy and compassion must flow. So I guess the short answer to your question is both and. Once we start concentrating just on caring for our existing flock, we become insular and will die.
This question comes from Lisa Phelps. Lisa asks, what is your belief about hell? That it is not just punishment, but eternal punishment. In my opinion, this does not reconcile with the kind of love which we know God has for us, in that he allowed his Son to go to the cross for us and for our sins.
Well, this isn't an easy one to answer in the confines of a question and answer session, but it's a really important question to wrestle with. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that although we don't know with any certainty what happens to us when we die or where we go, we can see glimpses of both heaven and hell, as we understand them, here on earth and in our life experience. I've known, as I guess many of us have, both ecstatic joy and abundant life, but also darkness, desperation, and a sense of feeling diminished. And we see it in the news, don't we? Human beings at their best and worst, and the impact that both of those have on them as people and on others. In terms of eternity, I'd want to put at the foundation the Christian belief that God's love is eternal, that God's very nature is love, and that God is forever reaching out to us in love and inviting us to respond to that love. No one stands outside of God's love, and no one is beyond God's loving reach, irrespective of what they've done. To put limits on God's love, to say that some people are irredeemable and beyond God's love, is to limit God. And the Christian belief is that God's love is unlimitable, otherwise God would not be God. The question is, it seems to me, what happens to those who refuse to accept God's love, whose inner being is so warped and twisted that they deliberately turn their backs on love and refuse to be drawn to it? Well, we don't actually know. But my sense is that the more we're open and able to embrace God's love, the more we're able to reflect that of God within us. The divine spark, if you like, grows bigger. The the light shines more brightly, moving us towards becoming more fully the people God created us to be. The less we're open to embrace God's love, in other words, the more we allow anger, hatred, bitterness, violence to live within us and get the better of us, the more diminished we are as people. The divine spark is smothered and we become less human. Perhaps that's what God gathers to himself when the end comes, all that is of him, however large or small. Whether there's anyone who's pure evil, purely anti-love, such that there is nothing human left of them, well, I think I'd want to leave that to God.
Our next question comes from Rachel Nelms. She asks, reflecting on your own childhood, what were the most influential factors that nurtured your faith?
Crucially, I think that being taken to church from my earliest days meant that liturgy, prayers and hymns were an integral part of me growing up. I grew to love the atmosphere and the drama of Sunday worship. Added to this, I was brought up in a musical household, and my father was a church organist. With a love for music myself, it wasn't long before I was part of the church choir, and it was here that I grew to know and love not just hymns, but the psalms and anthems that were sung as part of evensong. They're embedded deep in my memory, along with the collects and prayers, part and parcel of my formation. But alongside all that, I was blessed to have a wonderful parish priest, a saint of a man, whose love of people and kind and gentle nature made a huge impression on me. In a very natural and unassuming way, he nurtured my faith and my love of the church, the foundations of my formation and sense of vocation to ordained ministry. My mum was also a big influence. Her care for others and her willingness to befriend people, whoever they were, taught me a lot about embracing difference and transcending barriers. That was real discipleship.
My question for the Bishop. Since you've arrived in Wales, what have you seen or heard that is very specifically church in Wales that excites you and gives you hope and might encourage us?
As you know, I've not been in Wales long, less than 9 months in fact, and 4 months of that time has been spent in lockdown. So not a lot of time to get to know the place or the churches, the history or the language. But what's excited me is what I've picked up of all those things. The first thing that struck me was the landscape, the beauty of creation almost everywhere you go. And I'm someone whose sense of God is intrinsically bound up with creation. So in every visit I've made so far, I've been surrounded by what I see as the hand of God in the landscape, and that's inspiring and uplifting and a tremendous gift. I've also been struck by the saints, most of them I'd never heard of before and know little if anything about. These Welsh saints and the often tiny churches dedicated to them speak to me of a unique history that has shaped both the country and the Church of Wales. Christianity, I think, is older here than in England and brought here via a different route, Ireland and Scotland with their Celtic influence. There's a strong sense of place that's linked to the churches, which carry the stories of small, sometimes ancient communities gathered around their place of worship. And linked to this, of course, is the Welsh language, the vehicle by which culture is transmitted, perhaps more than anything else. It's good to be in a church that honours that by its commitment to being bilingual. So, as I see it, the Church in Wales has a history that runs deep and is rich in its spirituality, a spirituality that's embedded in its very landscape, its culture and heritage. And I think there are deep wells here that we can draw on, which still speak to people's deepest needs and chime in well with some of the most concerning issues of our own time: isolation, belonging, community, and caring for the planet, the home that we all share.
Hi, Bishop Cherry. I also have a question of my own. I was wondering if you have a favorite book or author, or even just something that you've read recently that you would recommend for us to read.
Well, so this is a tricky one because I love books and it's hard to pick out just one to recommend. But I've decided to go with John Swinton, whose book Living in the Memories of God I read a few years ago. It's a wonderfully affirming exploration of dementia and the grace of God. At the heart of the book are two questions that John asked himself when he was a hospital chaplain. Who am I when I've forgotten who I am? And what does it mean to love God and be loved by God when I've forgotten who God is? In a society that fears dementia and the very thought of losing our memories above almost anything else, it's both hopeful and inspiring in equal measure. The book reminds us that we are children of God, even when we lose some of our human faculties. And John's other book, Becoming Friends of Time, is also profound and well worth a read. This is about disability and what people with disabilities can teach the rest of us about having time for love, and so having time for God.
Well, there were definitely some really interesting questions in there, so thank you all for sending them in, and thanks Bishop Cherry for taking the time to answer them. We may be doing something like this again soon, so watch this space.